Mick Jagger told me, he goes, the reason I ended up playing bass on the Stones stuff is because he goes, I like your bass line on Reverend Black Gray. He goes, it's the best symphony for the devil symphony. Sympathy for the devil ripoff I've ever heard. Which is the fucking, what a compliment. You know how many people have ripped that fucking song off?
Yeah, was that when Mick got in touch for you to produce the Bridges to Babylon album?
Well, yeah, that's a whole nother story in itself, if you want to get into that. But that's really related. Michael made that open that door because Michael, this actually leads right into this. So Michael was the person, he heard the Black Grape record and lost his mind. And the U2 guys told me this great story. And then, Jesus, man, I'm getting fucking Alzheimer's.
What was the story?
What's the guy that, no, I know the story. What's the guy that owned Island Records?
Chris Blackwell? Chris
Blackwell. He told me the same story separately later. So Michael had a olive farm in Graz. Edge and Bono also had houses in the general vicinity. They all lived on this mountain. So literally, like, if you were at Edge's house, you could see Michael coming up the hill, right? But you could also hear Michael coming up the hill. And like, he had this open top Jeep, I guess, or something. So he would be rolling up the hill, and they said for at least a month straight, every time they knew it was Michael because he was cranking the Black Grape record. And Chris told me that same story later. So Michael loved that record. And Michael actually called Sean and asked him, like, hey, man, I love the fucking production, And of course, Sean, you got to call fucking D. You got to talk to fucking D. And so Sean hooked that up. Then I met Michael. He was working on solo stuff, went to London. We started working together. That was going great. And, that was like my first experience with a real, Sean's a rock star, but he's kind of an anti-rock star. He's in his own category. There's only Sean right there. But Michael was like a real conventional, textbook rock star, So we were going out to really expensive dinners. And then after we would go to the night, we went to this club called Brown's, and we were in Brown's. Mick and Ronnie Wood walked in, the Jagger and Ronnie Wood, and I was shitting myself, man. Like, the closest I had ever been to Mick was LA Coliseum in 1981 in the 80th row or something, right? So the next thing I know, I'm talking to Mick, and they're, talking about Mick was working on a solo record at the same time, and Mike was like, oh, you gotta hook up with Danny, and like right in front of me, man. It was amazing. Because how many people would have done that? He was so fucking generous, So Mick was raving about me to Mick. And at some point in the night, I remember Mick Jagger, he sort of waved me over, and he was sitting by himself, and we started really getting into it about like what he was working on and the things about it that weren't going well. And I just looked at him and I said, hey, why don't let's just do a day in the studio together, man. I go, don't worry about money or anything. I go, it'd be worth it for me to just get to spend an afternoon. Let's go work on a song, and if it goes well, we'll take it from there. Which was definitely the right fucking thing to say. So then about a week and a half later, I got a call in LA because I went back to LA, week or 2, 3 weeks, whatever it was. And it was this guy, Jerry Harrington, who's since passed. But Jerry was a really interesting dude because he was actually Joe Strummer's manager. He was this uber rock fan. And he grew up in New York, and he saw those bands on the Lower East Side. So he was like a super punk snob. But at the same time, he was also a manager. He managed actors like Brad Pitt and stuff at this company called Brillstein Gray. But his passion was music. And he was friendly with Mick. And he called me, he said, I saw Mick last night. We had dinner. He was talking about you. He wants you to call him because he was in LA. And gives me the number, and it's like, oh my gosh, is Mick there? Calling Mick Jagger. Hi, Danny. He's like, right, I thought about your offer, and I want to take you up on it. We've got a studio. And so I drove out to then a couple days later, whatever it was, go to the studio, and we did that. We just spent the day in the studio, and we ended up working on a couple of songs, and it went amazing. It went fantastic. And I'm like, cool, I got this, right?
Were you nervous going into the studio?
It was weird. It was like, Of course I was fucking nervous, but at the same time, I was ready. Like, I don't know how to describe it. Like, I was so ready and I was so comfortable. Like, I was just so excited to be there. You know what I mean? And to have an opportunity, because to me, and then when these things started coming up, not so much with Michael, because Michael, I wasn't like a huge INXS guy or anything. But as I got to know Michael, it was actually better for Michael, because Michael really was looking to reinvent sound, you know. But with the guys like Mick and Bowie and U2, and Reeves Gabrels had this saying, he used to say, it's like playing Cowboys and Indians. It's like, I was a fucking fan, right? But then I have this skill set. So like, I always just tried to make the record. And that was all at a time in their careers where they were sort of far enough away from what they had established themselves with. And with the Stones, it's such a rich legacy. I mean, there's so many places to go musically that are legit, that they wrote the book on, right? So I was always kind of just trying to make the record like the ultimate fan would want to hear, you know? But funny part of the story is this. So then we have this amazing day in the studio. Couldn't have went better. And I'm busy. Things are going great for me. But it's Mick Jagger. It's like I'm waiting for the fucking phone to ring. Phone don't ring. A few months go by. It's like nothing's happening. I'm like, what's going on? And me and Jerry were really good friends. And it's funny because I think Jerry wanted me to get the gig more than I did, because he knew he'd be able to hang out, right? So finally, Jerry calls me. He's like, hey, Charlie Watts had a big band at the time. He was doing a show in LA. He said, come down to the show because Mick's going to be there. So, and we, like the royal we can find out what's going on. So I'm like, cool. So I go to the show, you know, and God bless Charlie. You know, got to know him a bit. He's a wonderful man. But 2.5 hours of Charlie Watts' big band is a bit much. But watch the show. So then we're in the backstage, and it's not a big place, you know, it's the Henry Fonda Theater or something. So we're in this room now, and it's just packed with people. And Mick is fucking surrounded. And I haven't seen him since the day we were in the studio. So I'm like, God, I'm just waiting for my moment, man, right? And he's surrounded. So I can't get in there. I can't I just want to say hello. So finally, I'm like, fuck it. I tapped him on the shoulder. And he turned around and he gave me that Mick face of like, and then he just turned back around and continued talking. It just completely blew me off. And I was gutted, you know, I'm like, but then the gutted turned into, well, fuck it, man. Fuck it. I don't need him. Fuck it, right? Of course, all playing out in my head. And then I got really like kind of bummed out. I'm like, oh God, he didn't even remember me. Like it was just crushing. But it's a good moral to the story because I don't know how much time passed. But then at some point in the not too distant future, I got a call. Mick wants, I can't remember if he called me what it was, but somehow I ended up on the phone with him and it's like, oh, Danny, it's Mick. Yeah, sorry the solo album didn't work out. I had to kind of put that on the side for the moment. But I was wondering, would you be interested in working with my band?
Wow.
I'm like, okay. Right, well, you're going to have to come meet Keith. And I was like, okay. Yeah, so I don't know if you want me to keep blathering on. Then
just tell me about when you first met Keith for the first time.
So then the next, because it's like, you know, it's like a labyrinth of steps. At least for me it was. So then the next step was, okay, go meet Keith. So they were locked out in, at the time, it was still called Ocean Way, might be Cello, which is this another iconic studio in LA, like Sinatra recorded there, the Beach Boys, everybody. So I go down to the studio, and they weren't really making the record yet. They were like just running songs. You know, they were locked out, they were recording everything, but I guess they were just getting all the ideas together and figuring out. They were starting to narrow it down, right? Because Mick had songs, Keith had songs. So I walk into the studio and, you know, I get directed to where the band is. And I'll never forget this moment. I walk in this lounge and all I see is the back of this head. And it's like sitting on a couch and the arms are both stretched out. The right arm has like an orange drink and the left arm has like a red wine looking trinket, right? And Mick walks me and he goes, "Right, Keith, come meet Danny Saber." And it's just like just even hearing them say your name is kind of like surreal, right?
Yeah.
So Keith gets up and he's like, "Hey," and then I got introduced to Charlie, and he goes, "Hi, I'm Danny." He's like, "Oh, I know who you are." He goes, "I like the Black Grape record a lot." He goes, "So you're going to be working with us?" And I go, I hadn't officially been told I have a job yet, but I go, "I hope so." And Charlie goes, "Well, I hope so too." And it's like, that's Charlie Watts, right? Just completely couldn't have been sweeter. And then the next step was like no words were even exchanged other than everybody started like filing into the studio, and there was all this equipment set up. And Ronnie wasn't there, funny enough, but Mick asked me, "Johnny, can you play the Wurlitzer?" And I'm like, "I can play a little keyboard." I'm like, "Sure." I go, "Yeah, I can play keyboard." He goes, "Right, Danny will play the Wurlitzer." So then they just got this like group. Daryl Jones was there. I met Bernard Fowler for the first time. I don't think Waddy was there. And Jim Keltner was there. And anyways, we just started jamming on this thing. And I found a little part and locked into it. It was cool because the keyboard, I was about 3 feet away from Keith. So Keith was like looking at me. And that was sort of my intro. Like that was my test, I guess, which was, thank God, but again, I was ready, The million times I sat down and fucked around on a keyboard and could find a part and lock in on it, I didn't want to be that guy who was like, "Oh, I don't really play keyboard. I'm not going to start giving him a story." It's like, "Can you play the fucking thing?" "Yeah, I can play it." That was my attitude. I ain't no keyboard player, but I found something that sounded kind of cool. And then the rest, that was sort of cool. That was the interview.
So how crazy was that? Thinking back to watching the Rolling Stones for the very first time as a kid, and then being in the studio playing alongside them.
Yeah, well, one thing I fucking figured out really quick was like it was all of that and everything you can imagine. And then the great thing about icons, and it's not, there's always an exception, but for the most part, whether it's the Stones or U2, they're icons for a reason. Like, obviously, there's a lot of reasons, but when you end up in a room with one thing that they tend to have consistent thing, and Keith is the best example of this. He knows everything you're thinking, right? And it's almost like splitting the duty of being Keith Richards and what you expect Keith Richards to be, but then he's still a person, right? Like he's still living his life, doing what he wants to do and being who he needs to be for himself. And that balance, right? Which those guys went through years to get to that point, I'm sure. So it ends up translating to these people live up to, at least from where I was sitting, they live up to everything you imagine they would be, but then more. Like the whole saying, "Don't meet your heroes." I don't agree with that. I mean, I've been lucky enough to meet a lot of them, and they all, I was in a unique position, because I was bringing something to the table. I wasn't just a fan of an autograph, but at the time I wasn't looking at it like that. I was just like, shit. The scene in Trading Places when Eddie Murphy's in the back and they're like, giving him cigars and all that shit. They're like, "You can walk out right now. I believe I can hang out with you guys." Like that was my attitude. Like, I can get all enamored and like caught up in the fact that this is so and so, but no, I want to hang out, man. I want to stick around, and having some usefulness was a pretty good chance they're going to let me stay. So that was my attitude. Like, get over it, dude, and fucking show these motherfuckers something, without being overbearing or it just came naturally, I guess. It seemed to work because one thing I'm proud of is all those people I worked with. The more that was at stake, I always got called back. I mean, it wasn't like I did one thing and that was the end of it. It kept me around for a while. I got to hang out for a while.
You mentioned that Michael Hutchence was a fan of the Black Grape record. So how did you actually come to work with him?
So look, the way I worked, it was really pretty what's the right word, unsexy or anything crazy. It's just, he sent my manager some demos, and they sent them to me, and hey, would you like to work with Michael Hutchence? And I heard the tunes, and they were cool. I liked what he was doing. And we got on the phone. It took about 30 seconds, because to be honest, I wasn't Michael Hutchence to me was always like, there was at least 2 girls I had gone out with that were fucking in love with him. So if anything, I kind of had that, like, my girl wants to fuck. But that's nothing unique. So then, once I got on the phone with him, it took about 30 seconds, and he was just so fucking cool. We talked about it. The next thing I knew, I was in London, at Andy Gill's flat.
At that stage, Andy Gill had already been working on
demos
with Michael.
So Michael had been making the rounds. He was like really trying to just define a sound, a solo sound outside of INXS. Because his biggest fear was that what was really starting to was happening. It was like a self-fulfilling prophecy because, A, you had all the tabloid shit, so he was becoming more famous for being famous. Then people were losing sight of the fact that he was a fucking singer, a great singer. And then grunge made a lot of things, which it should have never been with INXS because they weren't a hair band, but it just made a lot of things seem dated, like really quick, and he got caught right in that because if you look at it, I went back when we were doing the film, I was doing some research and I realized that, you think of INXS as the 80s, but that Wembley show when they were sort of at the height of their powers, that was like 91, I think.
Yeah.
And it was 91, man. And it literally, I think when Nevermind came out, 92? Yeah. Maybe even 91, I don't know. But it wasn't a very long period of time. So he had been like, trying to he wanted to do a solo thing. And he had done the Max Q thing, which was pretty cool. But, they were too big at that point. And there was a lot of interference from the label and the management. Nobody wanted that to succeed. So that was sort of like a fool's errand putting that record out. The record itself was really cool. He was doing some really cool shit, but it just didn't stand a chance from the marketing side. So he sort of came back to it. He had been working. He started where he worked with Tim Simonon from Bomb the Bass. He was just sort of making the rounds with different people. And him and Andy got quite a bit of traction. They had about 10 songs at this point. They were all pretty good, but he still felt something was missing. And I was sort of brought in initially from the production because he loved Black Grape. He loved the Black Grape record. And Andy was sort of pretty established guy at that point. He had been around for a while. So I think he just wanted some youth. He wanted some that youthful energy, and we hit it off big time. He was, so great to be around and work with and very honest. I remember probably the first or second night, he just at one point just looked at me and goes, "Listen, man, I just want you to know I'm super happy with everything we're doing. It's beyond my expectations. Like, you're fucking amazing." And he was the first real big rock star I ever worked with, because Sean's sort of in his own, Sean's definitely a famous musician and I would go as far as to say, but Sean's almost like an anti-rock star. He's in his own category. There's only, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And Michael, that's what, like going out to nightclubs and fancy dinners and, Mike knew how to spend money, man. He was very generous. So it was that first experience of dodging paparazzi and, that kind of shit.
The album was released when Michael died. It obviously took a long time to finish afterwards. What sort of state was the album in before Michael died?
Yeah, it was in pretty good shape. It wasn't mixed, but the batch of songs we had, the ones that were there when I got there, those were all finished. We had done some mixes on those. But what was happening was Possibilities, remind me, Possibilities, what's one of the other ones I wrote? Breathe, we had started writing together. So probably what would have ended up happening is we had written about 3 or 4 songs together at that point. So Andy was sort of, he wasn't out of the picture, but Andy was sort of in London. Michael every time he came to LA, we would we would do writing sessions. So we got about 3 or 4 songs, and we were on this trajectory, and everything we were doing was fucking killer. You know, Baby It's All Right was the last one we wrote that on that trip. We probably would have written another song or two, you know, and then we were talking about putting a live thing together, and it was going to be a whole fucking thing. I mean, but to answer your question, you know, everything was in pretty good shape. The songs I wrote were demos, really. They were from writing sessions. So we would have put more time and energy into those together. So I really missed him on that. But for the most part, the record was, he knew what was there, and he you know, he was into it. So he had, you know, sort of, his stamp was on that stuff for the most part. You know, what sucked was, you know, he died, and then, you know, I mean, I couldn't even listen to it. It took about a year and a half. And then they ended up making a deal with V2, but we were like the first release on V2, or one of the first releases. So they weren't even really set up as a company yet. Then you've got the fact there's nobody to promote the record, you know, and again, you know, it's almost like the curse of Michael's solo stuff. I mean, it did fine. It did okay in Australia. I mean, it went gold or platinum. I don't know what the fuck that even means, you know. I think if you sell 50,000 records in Australia, it's gold. So it did good in Australia, but outside of Australia, it never really saw the light of day.
And there's also plenty of unreleased songs. Some were heard on the last Rockstar documentary, which you were involved with. You know, and you've sent me the songs, and they're great songs. And when I spoke to Andy Gill before his death, he told me he had some tracks as well. Do you ever think there will be a day where those tracks will get released? Because it's a travesty if they don't, because they're
well, fantastic. and sort of just as a little disclaimer for there's a handful of people out there. I just want to make sure, just kind of wanted to use this as an opportunity to let some people know, you know, the bottom line is there's some things behind the scenes that are beyond my control that are keeping it from being released. And that's all I can say. And there was a pre-sale. The intention was, you know, and this was everybody's intention. I mean, I thought this was going to be no problem whatsoever. The idea was Channel 7 Australia paid for the film. We held back the release of the songs. The plan was to, you know, tweak the edit, maybe change the narrator on the night of release the learn. You know, they had this, you know, we had to make some compromises, and then release the film internationally in the rest of the world, because it was only released in Australia, or it was only broadcast in Australia, and I think New Zealand. And then that would be accompanied with this package we were working on and putting together. And some people, you know, bought the package, but that was handled by the lawyer for the estate. Like, I mean, I was told it was happening, and that's about as much involvement as I had in it at that point, because we hadn't got far enough down the line with what was going to happen with everything to start putting that together. But all the pieces were there. So the intention was to put it out. It was never, you know, again. So the bottom line is this: there's some things that have now are very close to kind of, hopefully, fingers crossed, finally being able to get the clearance, you know, to run the interference, you know what I mean, and get the stuff out. In the meantime, you know, there's some people that pre-bought the thing, and, you know, you know, I'm working on trying to get either A, get them their money back, or B, hopefully get them what they wanted in the first place, you know. But again, just, you know, I never received a penny for that. And I've had a handful of people, because unfortunately, I'm the face of this thing. So, you know, but if a real estate agent sells you a bad house, you don't go back to the guy that built it. You know what I mean? It's like, it just doesn't work that way. So I'm working on it, so everybody knows. And yeah, you know, there's hopefully now, I think we're the things that needed to happen in order to allow it to come out. Because the whole thing is this: the whole point of that documentary and re-releasing those songs was to have something current, you know, a vehicle to really drive everybody back to INXS, you know what I mean? And let Michael finally kind of take his place in the pantheon of greats. I mean, he's never really got his just due, and he deserves it, because he is one of the great frontmen of all time, in more than my opinion, you know. And he was super respected, you know, by hence that's why I got the Rolling Stones gig, because Mick, you know, and Mike were chopping it up at Brown's, and, you know, Mick found out I was working with Michael, and Michael generously was telling Mick how great I was. So, you know, people paid attention to him. You know what I mean? And the band too. You know, I mean, that's the one great thing about doing that film and going back to it gave me such a greater respect for INXS as a band. Because let's be honest, if it wasn't for INXS, nobody interested in what I'm doing. You know, so that was really the whole point. So it would make no sense to do this unless it's got to be done right. You know, otherwise it kind of defeats the purpose of the whole exercise. And there's been so many weird, let's just call it, Michael. When I have this thing, when people die, they leave like an energy or a residue, and whether it's a big rock star that everyone knows or some friend of yours, there's like the energy they leave behind is pretty much driven by the memories that are fostered by that person's life, right? So Michael died under pretty shitty circumstances, and it sort of left a bad taste in everyone's mouth, either directly connected to it, you know, even the fans, it's just confusion and like sadness. And so trying to put a little bit of a happy ending on a very unhappy story, which is where this has all been heading, is really the whole point, you know. And if that can't be done, there's no point in me like throwing shit out without this one's consent. You know what I mean? It's got to be done right. That's the bottom line. So I think we're close, but you know, I'm dealing in decades on this one. So you know what I mean? Another 6 months, another 3 months. It's like, if that's what it takes to get the circumstances to be right to put it out, that's what has to happen. So, but I think we're close. So.
Yeah, that's good news because, as I said, you know, you sent me the tracks, and you know, I've had them for a long time now, and they're very, very good, and they need to be heard. But the fans want to hear these songs, you know.
Well, exactly. It's precisely. It's all really for them, you know. It's like, and again, it opens up the door to then having that conversation and reminding people of how great he was, and then the band, and then hopefully the dust can settle. I mean, they've run out of people to put in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, you know. Mm-hmm. INXS should be in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. I mean, some of the, you know, nothing against anybody else that's already in there, but like, fucking break. I mean,
absolutely, I agree.
There's bands in there that open for them, you know, like, come on.
When you were in the middle of recording the record with Michael and Andy, and then Michael had to go off to Australia for the rehearse for the Elegantly Wasted tour, to do the rehearsals for the tour. When was the last time you seen Michael before he left?
Yeah, I seen him on I think it was Thursday or Friday, and I think he was dead by Monday. So we were together like literally that weekend, or what, I can't remember the days now, but you know, it was not long. It was days. It was within a week for sure. You know, I've told the story a million times. You know, he didn't want to go, and you know, but it's like when especially with bands, with those kind of bands at that level, and I've seen this, it becomes like the changing of the seasons. You know, and then record, tour, and like it takes on its own momentum and its own energy. You know, and that's sort of what hopefully if we recut the film, that's really what I want to get into. I actually want to read you something. It'll only take a second. I wrote this thing called The Dark Night of the Soul, but I'll just read the opening thing. It's just a couple lines. Though Michael Hutchence died tragically, the way he lived and who he was is as far from the word tragic as you can get. Michael had a thirst for living that was virtually unquenchable. Like with so many who achieve rock stardom, many of the qualities that allowed him to reach the highest highs were also some of the same ingredients that contributed to his demise. So that pretty much says it all, man. You know, it's all the things that make you great and all the things that can flip. And unfortunately, the people that are probably the closest are the least able to really be there because they're vested in the whole thing too. So I was sort of in this unique situation because I was doing side thing with him, right? And I was coming up, I was on the upswing. So I was on one half of me, God, I wish I knew what I knew now then, but then I would have probably been no use to him because that was the whole point, that I was young and I was like, you know, it was that energy, you know, and obviously my skill set, but the energy that he was looking for. He wanted something fresh, you know what I mean? So, you know, we all could see what was going on. It was obvious, you know, he told us, you know, and he was in a weird space, and things weren't right. It wasn't the same guy. And I had knew him for over about a 2.5, 3 year period. So it wasn't that long, but anybody that works on music, like in a real way, will tell you, you could go in the studio for a day, and by the end of the fucking day, you know that motherfucker. So trust me, for music time, it was a lifetime. And unfortunately, he was already on. It was almost like predestined. That's what happens. It's just like the energy. He was no longer in control of events. Events were controlling him. You know what I mean? That's more sort of. That's not an unusual story when it comes to fame. So that's really what it all boils down to. The dude needed a fucking break, man. No one would let him take one. And he didn't have the strength to just fucking, for a lot of reasons, to just, knock it on the head and say, you know what? I'm fucking done. I'm taking a break, man. I need a break.
Where were you when you heard the news about his death?
I was in the fucking studio. I was walking down the hallway, and like there was a TV on in one of the lounges. And like right at that moment, I think the phone rang, my cell phone rang, and it was my wife. And it was weird because we were going to see the Stones in Vegas. And I can't remember why, because she didn't want to fly. She ended up on this, she ended up in an RV. I can't remember who she was with, like guys from Guns N' Roses. She was with a band in an RV going to Vegas. And then I was going to fly, because I had to stay in LA to work, or was something had to be done. I don't remember. So I was going to fly in the next day. So she ended up in Ronnie Wood's room, and Joe, Ronnie's wife, took care of her because she was a wreck. To be honest, then it was weird. Then I saw Mick, and Michael had introduced me to Mick. So it was kind of like strange because I'm in this environment in Rolling Stones world, and the dust is settling, and never really had time to absorb it. It was just it was really weird, man. It's fucking weird. But yeah, I heard it walking down the hallway on MTV News. Beep, 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 beep. And I was like, what? And right at that moment, it was just it wasn't now. It was still, I think I had a pager with texts, phones, fucking record plant phone, weird shit.
The state coroner, Derek Hans, reported that Michael's death was suicide while depressed and under the influence of alcohol and other drugs. Do you believe that? Do you believe he committed suicide?
Well, no. I mean, I think when we were doing the film and I said something, and then I didn't even understand what I said. The guy asked me that same question, and I said, there's no way he would leave the planet if he was in his right fucking mind, right? So what with the daughter, and he had a lot of bright spots. Life wasn't all dismal, for him. Like I said, it's but he had a lot of shit pulling at him. He had a lot of stress, with Paula and the kids, and she could, and Bob, and this whole thing. And it was and he was dealing with a lot of shit. And who knows where his head was at in that moment? Bono wrote that song, Stuck in the Moment. It's about Michael, because maybe it was just a moment. And who knows where, but I don't think whatever he was doing, whatever that reason that belt was around his neck, my whole thing is he never should have been in a position for that to even be in the fucking equation. He's in his hometown, and there's not, one person, and people were there, and people had left, and he had dinner with his dad, but he was still super fucking alone, man. That should have never happened. So you can't just point to one thing and say it was suicide. It doesn't work that way. It's way more complex than that. But for me, the whole thing boils down to he should have never been in that position, man. He deserved better, But anyways, a lot of it, though, man, it bucks, it's him, too. He has a responsibility in this. So, it's complicated. It's too complicated to, if you really want to try to unpack it, it's you need a movie.
Right, let's move on to something else.
Let's talk about something.